Willkommen zu Training the Archive. Dies ist eine Reihe von Interviews, welche Training the Archive, ein Gemeinschaftsprojekt des Ludwig Forum Aachen und des Hardware Medienkunstverein Dortmund in Kooperation mit der RWTH Aachen begleiten. Training the Archive untersucht die Anwendbarkeit künstlicher Intelligenz auf Kunst und das Kuratieren von Kunst. Dafür widmet sich das Projekt 2020 bis 2023 visuellen Archiven und der Frage, wie in diesen Sammlungen neue Zusammenhänge mittels Machine Learning hergestellt werden können. Für die Interviews werden KünstlerInnen und KuratorInnen und TheoretikerInnen befragt, die in den vergangenen Jahren wesentliche Beiträge zum Forschungsfeld der Bildproduktion und künstlicher Intelligenz geleistet haben. Training the Archive wird gefördert im Programm Kultur Digital der Kulturstiftung des Bundes und von der Beauftragten der Bundesregierung für Kultur und Medien. Als heutige Interviewpartner begrüße ich die Theoretiker Nick Coultrie und Ulysses Mejias. And I'm switching to English now. Welcome, Nick and Ulysses. Let me introduce you. Ulysses Mejias is a professor of communication studies and director of the Institute of Global Engagement at the State University of New York at Oswego. His research interests include critical data studies, philosophy and sociology of technology, and political economy of digital media. Nick Coultrie is professor of media communications and social theory at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and from 2017 has been a faculty associate at Harvard Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society. His research interest includes media and communications, culture and power, and social theory, and the consequences for everyday reality of symbolic power's concentration in particular institutions. Together, Ulysses and Nick wrote the book, The Coast of Connection, How Data is Colonizing Human Life and Appropriating It for Capitalism, published in 2019 at Stanford University Press, which is at the center of this interview. Nick and Ulysses, the analysis which you have delivered is rich and extensive, and we will only be able to tackle a few points. To approach the topic, I'd like to ask you a few definitions from the top of your head, so to say. So the most obvious first is, what is data? Do you have a specific understanding of data that refers to other scholars or differentiates from them?
Basically, the data is the material that's produced by abstracting the world into categories and other forms of format and so on, so that it can be stored as data in databases and then processed as data, feeding into algorithmic decision making and so on. So in theory, any aspect of the world whatsoever can be converted into data by being given a related category, and that category being activated within a database. So we're interested in all sorts of data, not just social media data, personal data, but data about nature. Any form of data is part of, as we see it, colonizing of the world for data extraction.
With the advent of this information, what we're finding is that the meaning of facts has become gamified in some ways. And I think thanks in part to the operations of digital data. So to me, I think if I had to define it according to how we use it in our work, data is just an instrument for extraction. Now, we're not saying that all data is an instrument for extraction. We're not saying that always in each single case that we have digital data that is being used this way. But in our work, I think that's what we're interested in looking at, how data serves as an instrument for extraction. Extraction from what in particular? Well, very precisely, I think we're saying our social lives. So data is a means to abstract information from our social lives and to quantify it and to use it to generate profit. So let me just give you an example. I think we can think about the social graph as an example of data about our social lives. So the social graph, as you know, is what Facebook basically built its business model on. It's just a network visualization or representation of all those social connections. It's basically my family, my friends, my coworkers, all of that data represented as a series of connections. But as we know, it's not just data that is valuable in terms of its social content. It's data that can be used very specifically to target advertisements, to predict behavior. So in all of these ways that corporations are now using it basically as an instrument to extract knowledge from this domain of our life and to use it to generate profit. So I think that's specifically how we're looking at data.
So what is, in your specific perspective, colonialism, and how have you arrived at this understanding or reading? And again, I'm asking if you could give us an example.
I think when we looked at the definition of colonialism, basically we just sort of think of it as economic dominance at a distance. And of course, it's not just an economic phenomenon. It's also, of course, involves politics and culture. But I think when we were framing our approach in terms of colonialism, we wanted to think separately from other concepts that do have similarities, but also important differences. So, for instance, when we looked at any tribute system as a form of payment to an external power, as itself a condition of dependence, obviously colonialism has an element of that. When we think, for instance, as many people are doing today, about feudalism as another model that could serve to illustrate some of these relationships, colonialism also has an element of that, an oppressive relationship between a lord and a serf, or a colony or a colonizer. But I think for us, what was interesting was that to look at colonialism as a global system of extractivism based on this power differentials between the colonizers and the colonized. So we give a very specific definition. For us, then, data colonialism is this emerging social order for the continuous extraction of data that we were just talking about, data from our lives for the explicit purpose of generating wealth.
Obviously, colonialism is and was a lived reality for hundreds of millions of people, an actual lived form of domination, being dominated. And it was associated for a lot of its history with imperial structures, particularly imperial forms of rule by the British in Africa and India and so on and so forth. We're looking at colonialism from a more specific point of view. As Ulysses has already implied, we're not talking about that long-term institutional build-up that became necessary to secure the grabbing of assets and the extraction of value, and let alone the appalling racism that justified that. We're trying to get to the absolute core of colonialism as we understand it, which was, if you like, and there's a German word for this, a rather nice one, Landnehmer, the land grab. Mm-hmm. Without the land grab, there was no colonialism. It was the grabbing of the land, the discovery of the so-called New World in the late 15th century, which was not known to be existent. Suddenly it did exist, and it was there for the taking by Spain and Portugal, that made the idea of modern colonialism, as opposed to old imperialism, which is thousands of years old, which made that possible. It took decades, then centuries to fully develop, but it's that initial land grab that we're interested in. The Spanish also have a wonderful word for it, despojo, the spoiling of assets and the grabbing of them, because it's that initial stage of the unfolding of a colonial power, of appropriation, of grabbing assets, that we think is going on in this beginning of a new phase of data colonialism, which in that sense is precisely parallel to the beginnings of the historical period of colonialism. Many people ask us, well, surely you're not saying that what's going on with Facebook is exactly like the East India Company or whatever. And of course, we're not saying that, because it took a long time, centuries for the East India Company to develop after the initial land grabs. And that was the third major or the fourth major colonial power, not the first. But we are looking at the beginning of that process, and that's where we see the really interesting parallels between the land grab that all of us have lived through in our lives when our data has suddenly become available to corporations we don't understand, and that initial period of grabbing land and minerals and bodies in the late 15th century. That's the core of the comparison.
Yeah, so, and maybe we can have a third definition, because in your book, as I perceive it, you are bringing these kind of three elements together, that is data, colonialism, and capitalism. And there are many notions of capitalism, and I wonder how you use capitalism, and capital. What's this notion to you? What kind of processes are being described by the notion of capitalism?
So the difference between this new phase of colonialism, data colonialism, and the original phase is that capitalism now exists. In fact, it came to exist through the land grab of centuries of colonialism. But of course, it can't be wished away now. It continues. And we are experienced actors in learning how to act under capitalism. So the new colonialism takes place in that context, 2 or 3 centuries of historically developing capitalism. What do we mean by capitalism? We broadly take on board Marx's, David Harvey's approach to capitalism in a broad sense. So capital is basically value, economic value that's in motion, that is able to be circulated, translated into other forms of value, which can expand through various forms of investment and production and so on and so forth. There is a debate about whether data literally is capital. Some people argue it is. Other people argue that sometimes it doesn't always behave like capital because a lot of it's locked up within corporations. IBM has no doubt a vast amount of capital based on its endless surveilling of everything. Whether it's able or willing to sell that as a commodity to others, that may or won't always be the case. So that maybe is something that is still in development. But the idea that data is associated with value of some form, that's pretty clear. So capitalism is the social system that exists around the maximizing of the value of capital through its circulation, through its investment, through intensification of production. And I think in a broad sense, it's clear that data is at the heart of contemporary capitalism.
There's a concept that we develop in the book that also helps to clarify some of these issues, and that's the concept of data relations. Because we did want to be very clear about the fact that if we limit ourselves to a framework of capitalism to try to understand what is happening with data, that framework might not be enough. And so I think historically we've tried to understand what is happening with information and with digital technologies by expanding this concept of labor relations. And labor relations continue to be very important, especially, for instance, when we think about what's happening with the gig economy, right? And how workers are transitioning from having full-time jobs with benefits to now being dispensable yet essential workers that do these gigs here and there, so many times for substantial wages. So labor relations are still important, are still crucial. But in the book, Nick and I try to argue that they're not enough. We need a new concept now to try to understand what's happening in capitalism, and that is the concept of data relations, which means that we're not looking only at what happens when we work. A lot of what we're describing happens actually when we're not working, when we are relaxing, when we are sending pictures to our friends or posting status updates on Facebook or on Twitter. We're not working, we are socializing, we're outside of work, and yet data is being collected at those moments as well and used for the generation of wealth on inequitable conditions. So that's why we also use this concept of data relations to sort of hint at all of these other processes that are happening within capitalism, but that go beyond this traditional framework of just looking at things from the perspective of labor relations.
Okay, so what you're doing is because some have argued that whenever data is being produced, it points toward that labor has been spent. But it seems to me that you're not completely agreeing with that, because you're maintaining that there is something like leisure time or non-productive time, even when data is being created.
And in thinking about the core of Marx's concept, Stone comes up with a fundamental insight, which is the core is abstraction. It's the abstracting from the messy flow of whatever I do in my office or my workshop, and abstracting from that a unit that I can produce, which can be sold for a fixed price on a market that depends on that unit having certain fixed qualities so that it can be recognized as worth £1 or whatever. That is the basis of commodification, abstraction. And when we read that, we realized this is exactly what's going on with data. We gave you the first definition of data. It is an act of abstracting from the flow of life. And so if that's true, why wouldn't it be possible at a later stage in history, 130 years after Marx was writing, 150, sorry, for us to now have new types of abstraction relation, which are data relations, which we enter into every time we accept that our daily life, when we are finally not working after an extended working week, when we're absolutely not working, is nonetheless abstractable for value. That cannot be a labor relation, even though many sociologists contorted themselves to try and pretend it was. It's not a labor relation. We know that. We don't call it a labor relation. Only sociologists will pretend it is a labor relation. It is a data relation. It is a non-labor extractive form of relating to capitalism through abstraction. And so that's why we have this double side. And we see that it's important to be creative with Marx's theory, because he for sure would have extended his theory if he was living in our age.
Well, Nick already addressed something which I wanted to ask in the next question, this question of abstractions, where my point was that money might be read as an expression of exchange value, which again is abstracted in spent labor time, and then personal data is rooted in human subjectivity. And the question was then, does the data subjectivity relationship simply replace the value labor abstraction, or how do both interact? I think you have fleshed this out already a bit in the last answer, but maybe you want to comment on that even a bit more.
What we're saying, and this is again the double nature of the argument, we're not saying everything we knew about capitalism is wrong, or equally everything we knew about historical colonialism is irrelevant. We're saying they all remain extremely relevant. But at this moment in history, we have a new layer of capitalism, a new type of invention, like a new type of relation that can feed in to the machine of capital growth, just as we have a new type of colonialism. So we both have the abstraction of value from our non-labor activities, which, since the rest of our life, by definition, labor means there's nothing in everyday life which isn't abstractable now for value. But at the same time, we have an intensification of abstraction of data from our labor activities. So if you're a worker on the Amazon warehouse, every single movement you make will be categorized by a robot probably observing you, checking whether you're going in the right direction or not, whether you're going at sufficient speed, whether you're behaving efficiently. And if you're not, maybe correlating that with other data they also have about you. So we see both a massive intensification of the gathering of data within labor relations and the gathering of data from what are not labor relations. But the two together make up the land grab that we call data colonialism as part of this huge intensification of capitalism at this particular point. If you like to sum up, our argument is basically about the intensifying relations between colonialism and capitalism, which have been going on for 500 years to reach a particular point of intensity, like a double helix now. They're twisting on each other ever more intensely and producing radically new results.
Yeah, I think that's a crucial point that Nick just mentioned, because I think our argument is that what we're seeing is a new phase in the relationship between capitalism and colonialism. I think a simplistic view sort of assumes that, okay, colonialism happened and now it's over. But we are basically speaking about a reconfiguration of history, a new way of trying to understand history that allows us to see that overlap, that way in which colonialism continues to inform capitalism. Yes, capitalism is no longer just about producing things. It's no longer just industrial capitalism. It's no longer just about services, informational capitalism. But in some ways, we're seeing sort of the perfection of capitalism's long established goal to absorb the social. So it's no longer just about consumption. It's about the reordering of every aspect of our social life so that every facet of it produces profit, whether we are working or not working. So to your question about whether we are seeing data subjectivity just replacing value and labor, that kind of abstraction, I think that in some ways becoming the same thing at a larger scale. Whether we're talking about value or labor or subjectivity or social relations, it's all becoming digital information that can be amassed, that can be processed and used to control not just workers in the factories, although it is used to do that as well, as Nick mentioned in the example of the Amazon warehouse, but also to control and to capitalize on people who are not working. So it's outside of that realm or that domain of work.
There's a lot of hype around notions of machine learning and artificial intelligence right now. And we are, with Training the Archive, we are participating in that hype and working also on pattern recognition and on machine learning project. And it's a kind of manifold project. We are developing a prototype on the one hand, but also do some kind of in-house reflection on it. Yeah, what's the role of so-called artificial intelligence or machine so-called learning from your perspective as a colonial data practice?
Well, again, I think from our perspective, it's very clear that artificial intelligence and machine learning, in many of the ways in which they're being used, they become an instrument of coloniality. They become an instrument to analyze, predict, to nudge behavior, and many times also to discriminate.
So here, give an example, maybe. Could you give maybe an example?
Well, I think, I was thinking actually of Lisa Gittleman's, the title of her book, that raw data is an oxymoron, right? So I think when we think about data, we think of something that exists in a pure form, and then it can just be analyzed for this or that purpose. But the collection and the analysis of data always implies an intention and always implies a politics. So if we have an artificial intelligence algorithm to decide whether people are going to get coverage by insurance, as has actually happened in a few instances that we've seen, those algorithms can be biased. They are trained with the data from the real world, and the real world is prejudiced. So using those tools to make decisions about who gets insurance, who gets a loan, who gets selected for a security check. All of those decisions, all of those predictions, some of those ways to nudge certain kinds of behavior can in fact discriminate. And if we think about it, this is only going to get worse, right? I think we're now saying that in a few years, by 2025, we are going to be generating about 175 zettabytes of data a year. 90 of those will come just from Internet of Things devices. And just as a reminder, a zettabyte is 1 trillion gigabytes. So we're producing more and more data. But we can't analyze all of it. Humans can look at all of it. So that's where artificial intelligence comes in as a way to sort of help us make sense of all of these huge amounts of data, but a way that's not unbiased, that's not disinterested, that always already implies an intention and a politics.
Okay, then, yeah, we are already proceeding to the last question. That's maybe, as I perceived it, you developed your book as a sort of a critique, so it's maybe a bit difficult to ask you this question, but anyway, it would be interesting to hear your take on how do you think these relations can be decolonized, or are there any options to decolonize them? And I would be open to an answer like, no, there's no way to do this. Maybe you have some comments on that as well.
We're not against data. We're not against large amounts of data being analyzed in an automated way when humans are unable to analyze it. And it's possible that pattern recognition in the medical field will discover the next cure for a particular type of cancer. It would take humans millions of years to do so because they can't read that amount of data. Clearly, we're not against that. What we are questioning is the idea that this type of knowledge is necessarily superior. And this we relate to the idea of coloniality that Ulysses introduced a moment ago. The concept of coloniality from the Peruvian sociologist Aníbal Quijano is the idea that many types of relations were transformed by colonialism, including knowledge relations. The idea that the West, because it had a superior rationality, was entitled to grab the land, because it had a superior religion and then a superior science, was entitled to measure the land, to read it in a certain way, interpret a certain way, extract it in a certain way according to its science. This was a profoundly colonial relationship, not just of power, but of knowledge. And we argue that this is also at the core with certain uses of big data, certain ways of thinking about machine learning, not all of them by any means, and we would want to think about better ways of using them. Some people call this dataism, the idea that more data is always better and the extraction of data, whether people consent to it or not, is necessarily good. So one starting point for thinking about changing things will be to say we want better ways of thinking about machine learning and artificial intelligence so that human values are consulted, so that these processes are oriented to human values, not just the values of a few elite humans, but the whole communities whose data is being extracted. That will be a starting point to rethinking how data relations should operate, not just in accordance with a sort of responsible code developed in an elite institution, which may never have been democratically consulted on outside that institution, but a genuine process of social thinking and reflection that enables data to be gathered and then used in a way that those people themselves would like to happen and continues to be accountable to those social purposes. I know that's abstract, but I think that's a starting point, at least, for thinking about what decolonizing might mean.
I agree. I think, yes, if the question is how would decolonized human social relations be organized, I think a simple answer is just without extraction for profit. And I realize it's very simple and yet very difficult to imagine. We're basically asking, demanding that we think of a world without capitalism, which, as we know, is very difficult to do. But I do think there are certain things that we can do to make progress towards that goal. And I think Nick has mentioned a few of them. I do think there are two important lessons that we can look at. I think, firstly, we need to learn from past movements of decolonization. So some people on this planet have actually been resisting colonialism for centuries. And we cannot simply adopt and adapt their struggles and make them ours through a process of appropriation, but we can certainly learn from them. And we can certainly express solidarity with those struggles as well. So if people in Palestine has been resisting settler colonialism through boycott, divestment, and sanctions, I think we can perhaps think about how do we apply those lessons to this struggle as well. And the other thing that I think is crucial to this movement, to the struggle, is imagination, because that has also been the other tool throughout colonialism that has been very important to resisting it. Colonialism, as we all know, doesn't just colonize resources and bodies, it colonizes the mind. So an exercise of decolonizing the imagination, decolonizing how we conceive of the world, I think can always be very productive and very fruitful. So this is, in fact, in many ways, battle of the imagination to decolonize worldviews and to conceptualize new ones that, at the very least, can think of social relations without this element of extracting data from them for profit. And I think that can be done.